Adrian on the screen, right? And as we're getting ready, he's going to introduce Pedro, right? Perfect. Yeah. Yeah, because we have both people on. We would now like to introduce Adrian Miller, author of Black Smoke, Americans and the United States of Barbecue.
Good evening. Welcome to Policing in Communities of Color, the sixth program in Changing the Legacy of Race and Ethnicity, Conversations for One America series, designed to encourage understanding and discussion of how together we can make changes now for a more just future. First, thank you to our sponsors, the National Endowment for Humanities, the Durango Herald, Ground Floor Media, and Center Table, Tate Law, Arapahoe Libraries, and the many community partners who are posting or streaming this program. A special thank you to Mike Ferrafino, President and CEO of the Colorado Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and Jesus Carrillo and technical producer Charlene Emery for providing media production services. I'd also like to recognize the Board of Directors and staff members on our Changing the Legacy of Race and Ethnicity Committee, and a special thank you to Colorado Humanities staff, Josephine Jones, and Executive Director Maggie Koval for their commitment in delivering this important programming. Tonight's moderator is Penfield Tate.
You want me to take his name down?
Penfield Tate is an attorney and former Colorado State Senator and House Representative. I turn it over to Penfield Tate.
Adrian, thank you so much for joining us. And on behalf of myself and the panelists, many thanks to Colorado Humanities for their work in this area and for making this program possible for all of us to participate in. And hello to all of you here with us this evening. Tonight, we're looking forward to a very, I think, thought-provoking and informative conversation talking about policing in communities of color. You've seen the bios of our panelists. Let me just tell you very quickly who's going to be with us. We have Vanessa Wilson, who was sworn in on August 17, 2020, as the Chief of Police for the City of Aurora and is the first woman to hold that position. Khuzair Mohammedbai is an attorney in private practice here in town who focuses exclusively on plaintiffs' employment in the civil rights arena and representing those whose constitutional civil rights have been abridged. And I think most importantly for this conversation tonight, he represents the family of Elijah McClain. We also have with us Justin Cooper, the Deputy Director of the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, an organization that works on legislation through the state and coordinates with other communities and other jurisdictions to deal with issues on a large policy level. And finally, Nick Mitchell, who may be familiar to many of you. He was the former independent monitor for the city and county of Denver when that position was created way back in the Hickenlooper administration. He has moved on to other things, but we're glad to have Nick, Vanessa, Justin, and Khuzair with us here this evening. Folks, we think this is a needed conversation because when you look around the country, there have been issues with policing, obviously. And if you've been in Denver for any period of time, you saw all of the protests last year that took place. It is important to note that in America's history, policing has a pretty unique foundation. From what is currently reported, it appears it started as early as the 1790s in Charleston with the establishment of the City Watch and Guard, which was a volunteer group that was essentially started initially to protect the white citizens of Charleston from the slaves who actually significantly outnumbered the whites in town. As policing morphed over time, it's reported that Boston was the first city that actually had a paid police force going back to the 1830s, and they had similar issues. But now we're looking at an environment where, as I've indicated, we've seen a number of issues with policing around the country. We've seen a number of protests, and I think it's good that we have the conversation here because before Ahmaud Arbery in February of 2020 and Breonna Taylor in March of 2020, and even George Floyd in May of 2020, we had Elijah McClain here in Aurora in August of 2019 when he lost his life as a result of an encounter with some police officers and paramedics. I wanted to start there and give and ask Khuzair and Vanessa to sort of talk about what, number one, what happened in Aurora and sort of what is happening in Aurora in terms of changes and how that community is responding to Elijah's situation, especially since we now know the Attorney General has said he's negotiating a consent decree. Indictments have come down. And Vanessa, you have the toughest job in the world because you're new and you're trying to make change, and the police unions have recently taken some votes. So, Khuzair, let's start with you and then transition to Vanessa. Give us your perspective of where things are, because Aurora may well be a reflection or not of the broader state of things in Colorado.
Thank you, Penfield. So where we are today is I think we're a community that is healing. And I think we're trying to make sense of what happened, but I think most importantly, all sides are trying to learn. And I would say move forward, but learn and try to just really understand the gravity of the loss with the idea that this will never happen again. So the death of Elijah McClain has really just taught us that Aurora and the rest of the Denver metro area is just an unbelievably beautifully complex situation. And universally, the loss of Elijah has devastated the community and I believe the police department. I should have, I suppose, started my remarks by saying and appreciating Chief Vanessa Wilson. Chief Wilson has been in the, just the crosshairs. And it is admirable that these high-ranking law enforcement officers will stand in front of the community and take question after question after question with varying degrees of emotion. And I cannot imagine how exhausting it is. I can tell you that I represent Shanine McClain. And Shanine McClain likes Vanessa Wilson. They have an open communication channel, and Chief Wilson has multiple times expressed unbelievable remorse and empathy for Shanine McClain. And for that, we thank you. What Elijah has taught us is that we really do need to look much deeper than we've ever looked, because this caught everyone by surprise. I think we have the violence surrounding Elijah's death was extremely troublesome. The purity, the innocence of Elijah, the love, his light that was snuffed out has really bothered and struck a chord with the community for a very long time. And so what we have here, to answer your question specifically where we're at, is I think we have lawyers, the survivors of police violence, and police that are trying to come together to figure this out. We have legislators, local, state, and federal, who have made very profound legal changes. And now what we are seeing is police officers being held accountable criminally. And this is a complicated issue for many, many people, particularly myself. Because I think most of us will see the criminal justice system as something that probably isn't to be celebrated or held up in some kind of high esteem. And so when we have police officers now going through the criminal justice system, it's a complicated issue. And while Shanine McClain certainly celebrates the prosecution of the officers, those of us who are, men of color, it's a tricky issue.
Vanessa, can you talk a little bit? I'm sorry, Kisera, were you?
I want to hear from the chief.
Okay, yeah. Vanessa, would you talk a little bit about sort of your journey in Aurora? You came in at a difficult time, and you sort of been running and haven't had a chance to stop and catch your breath up to this point. But I know there are some things going on that you cannot comment on, and I'm sure our listeners will understand that. But talk a little bit about what is going on and the change you're trying to bring, and the transparency you've talked about bringing to the Aurora force.
Well, first off, thank you, Kisar, for those kind words, and I just want to express yet again for everyone on this panel and anyone that's listening that I cannot say I'm sorry enough to Ms. McClain, and we lost a beautiful soul that evening. And what I can do and what others can do is try to learn from this death. And so it's not in vain. and to take seriously the reform that the nation has called for this last 18, 20 months, 2020 to 2021. It's still being called for, and people are demanding change. And I am trying to do the very best I can to do it in a way that respects all life and everyone that comes through the city of Aurora, lives and works here, as well as trying to know that there are good people in the policing profession, and that they are in a system that is changing and evolving, and that they are trying to navigate that as well. And so, again, obviously, we all know about the tragic loss of Elijah. We also know about the Attorney General's report on my agency, which I've shared with you that I can't talk about because we are in confidential meetings talking about coming to some sort of agreement, or not agreement, but hopefully coming to an agreement on entering a consent decree, as well as the fact that the 3 of my officers, one is an ex-officer, but 2 of my current officers have been indicted, as well as the fire paramedics. And so I can't really talk that way. I would never want to influence or affect their right to a fair trial. And so I've got to really steer clear of those things. But I think we have learned a lot from Elijah that evening. Some things that I noticed right away when I saw the video, and we were learning of the circumstances around it. And I think the thing that jumped out at me was, what is a suspicious person? And that was the call that evening. And immediately I thought, Elijah was called in as a suspicious person. I think everybody knows those facts. I'm not, saying anything I shouldn't be there. And I think it screams, what is our implicit bias, right? Trayvon Martin, we go back, we look across the nation of the implicit bias that not only community members have, people that are calling in, police that are responding. I mean, it's something that we need to talk about. And so I was like, how do I stop? How do I take a pause if a suspicious person call comes in? Because I've said this before, but for years we trained police officers literally in scenarios of, here's the location you're going, here's the description of the quote unquote suspect. You are to go there, contact that person, write a report, and either there's nothing going on or there's something going on, but you will make contact. And I said, we're doing that on calls for service. We're doing that on someone else's observations, and we're training them almost robotically to do this, A, B, C, D, and E. And I said, we need to take those calls from the community when they call in and they feel that someone is, suspicious, but give the officers an opportunity to pause, watch for themselves of what is happening, not feel as though they have to rush in, not feeling as though they have to make contact, but knowing they're going to be supported by me if they watch and say, this person isn't doing anything wrong, and I'm going to go ahead and clear this call. Maybe call the reporting party back and say, thank you for calling in. We appreciate you, when you hear something, say something. We're always asking people to engage in their community, but we also need to make sure that we're recognizing there could be bias in that caller. And so giving officers the opportunity to stop, see for themselves, be granted the fact that I'm not going to expect them to contact someone if there's not a justification to do so, and giving them the opportunity to say nothing to see here, and never have that negative interaction. When I was on the road as a sergeant or a lieutenant, I would hear the suspicious persons calls of 3 Hispanic kids walking through a community with backpacks, and people were calling them in because they weren't who they thought, right, were supposed to be in their neighborhood. And so officers, again, I would see them go contact those individuals, that robotic response. Now I have kids that have been contacted by police, have a negative influence, a negative opinion probably about that contact. They go home and their parents are like, what do you mean you were stopped? For what were you doing? Nothing. I was just walking down the street. And then I'm getting phone calls of, why did you contact my child? And it was a call for service. We've got to stop that. We've got to stop that and say, you know what? We will go to an area, but the community has to understand that if nothing is going on criminally and we cannot prove that something's going on criminally, we don't make that contact. And I think the legislatures, legislators in 217 are making that, clear what their expectation is. But when we talk about community service, people want a police officer to respond to everything they call for. And we have to know that officers can't continue to do that, because it puts us in situations where we could be considered profiling. We could be considered doing all these things, and really, sometimes they're responding to what the community is asking. So I know I went on a long rant on that, but I just really wanted to say that was a major thing that came out of Elijah's case. And I changed the directive to allow my officers to not contact. You go, you observe, and then you decide whether or not you make that contact. It doesn't have to be an automatic. And I'm hoping that's helping. Another thing I saw, is a lot of times officers will get into a struggle with an individual, and we don't know where this person is coming from. We don't know if they've had a bad experience before, if they're reacting out of fear, if they can't understand us, if they can't communicate a different language, all these different things of why they may be not complying. And so I think when officers are involved in a struggle, when other officers arrive on scene to help, we need to get that officer that may be kind of frozen in that moment, if you will, or kind of a tunnel vision. We need to get that officer out of the situation. Because if I can remove that officer that may be scared, agitated, whatever that they may be experiencing, because we're human beings, this is just a uniform. We all have these reactions. If I can remove that officer from that situation and have someone that's not involved, cooler head perhaps, because they weren't just in a struggle, for them to deal with that individual or that subject in a different way. And so we've called it the officer relief program or directive. So when officers, they're tapped out, if you will, better, easy way to explain it. They're pulled out of that scene, and so that another officer can evaluate without having them focused on what just happened, but focus on what's happening right now, what the subject is doing right now, and is what we're doing need to be addressed or changed. And so those are just two things that, when I've talked to Shanine, that really come from Elijah's case.
Vanessa, it's interesting as you describe that and you talk about what you're doing with your force. You raised an issue that I have in other contexts, which is, this whole thing started because someone made a call and said, I see a black kid walking down the street and he looks suspicious. Is there some educating we need to do to our community in general in terms of how we relate to one another and how we interact? I mean, from everything I've read, Elijah was walking in his own neighborhood. Number one, it's unfortunate that people didn't know he was a kid in the neighborhood. But secondly, it's distressing that someone can just make an anonymous call and say, I see something suspicious, and then you have this sort of potential encounter.
Yeah, I think it is something we have to talk about. We should be teaching in schools, in my opinion. We all have implicit bias, all of us. And realizing what is your implicit bias, and there's tests out there that you can take, but you have to be willing to open yourself up to realizing and accepting what it is that you're fearful of, or what biases you may have for whatever it is, your upbringing, your past experiences, your education, whatever it may be that's causing that. But yes, it's a huge issue, I think, that we categorize people. We categorize neighborhoods sometimes as a community, a poorer neighborhood. For some reason, that equating with more danger. I mean, these are the things we see on television, right? That are perpetuated in movies and TV shows. And I think that we have to look at how we're portraying one another, and then we have to have real solid conversations about recognizing those biases and making sure they don't come into the workplace. And then even in our own police department, even in our own, companies, not just the police department, but any companies, race is an issue, and race is an issue that we all need to talk about and stop shying away from that conversation.
Well, it's interesting to hear about the things that you're doing, and we'll get back to that. But, as people have talked about a need to bring about change and how this interaction happens, and we need to be clear, it's communities of color in the broader community. It's not just in the Black community. But one of the things I hear people talk about is we need more sorts of reform, like independent monitors, which we had in Denver and created some years ago. So, Nick, I want to transition to you and talk about your experience there and what you're seeing around the country with regard to the whole idea of independent monitors. And I would tell you, I think the timing of this conversation is so interesting because I see that I believe either today or yesterday, a jury just returned a verdict of $2.5 million for someone who was shot by Denver police back in 2013. So talk a little bit about your experience and what you're seeing around the country with independent monitors.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Penfield. Thank you for inviting me to be here on this panel, and it's an honor to be with everyone here. And I think it really relates very clearly to Cuser's points and the chief's points. What police executives have observed, what mayors and city managers, and what communities have observed is that the loss of legitimacy that police departments experience when there is misconduct or misbehavior or abuse by police officers towards community members, and that behavior is reviewed and essentially approved of by command staff in that police department. There's a tremendous loss of respect and esteem for the officers in that excuse me, the officers in that department and for the command staff in that department. Excuse me. And so what communities around the country have begun to do, and really it's a trend that's been developing for many decades, think about new ways to evaluate and investigate and review complaints of misconduct that are filed against police officers by community members. Denver has had several iterations of independent oversight. There was a Public Safety Review Commission that existed under prior mayors. It made up of community members who reviewed allegations of police misconduct. In 2004, as you mentioned, Penfield, the city of Denver created a position of independent monitor of the police department. There are different forms of civilian oversight, but I think some of the commonalities are the positions need to be independent. They need to be well funded. They need to have sufficient staff with the right kinds of experience and expertise to do investigations and review investigations. They must review all allegations of serious misconduct against police officers in their jurisdiction, and then ultimately report back to the community on what they find. Most major cities in the United States have developed some form of civilian oversight. Some have independent monitors, some have inspectors general, some smaller communities have community boards that get involved in these kinds of cases. All of it is working in the direction of building greater legitimacy, helping to repair that broken trust that we've seen in so many communities, between the community and the police department. And it's a trend, as I said, that began many decades ago, but has only become more pronounced and more widespread in the last several years, as there has been increasing community trauma, or maybe just increasing public awareness of the amount of community trauma that's out there regarding loss of trust in police departments in America.
Nick, I'm curious, and from your experience, you hear a number of people. I'm beginning to see this pushback in the U.S. now, where many are saying, there's not really a problem, and people are making much to do over nothing. It's just a few isolated instances. We need to support the police. But you hear other people say, well, we know that we've got at least a few bad apples. You do in every profession, in every situation. So how has or can an independent monitor's office effectively maybe even help a municipal government sort of weed out the problem actors based on using an independent monitor? And have you seen that be effective any place?
Yeah, I think it's effective in many places. Certainly they're not perfect systems, and each there are many critiques that can be and should be lodged against the civilian oversight systems that exist in America, but they are helpful because, if you look at, Chief Wilson, who's with us here today, and obviously trying to take many, noteworthy steps to repair that broken trust, she can't know about each one of those. There's too much on her plate. There's too much on any chief's plate to really know about all of the allegations that have been filed, to be in the weeds on each one of the investigations that is conducted or needs to be conducted. I think many sort of forward-thinking law enforcement leaders and municipal leaders have identified that having additional scrutiny can be extremely helpful in identifying the problems before they, the goal is to identify the problems before they metastasize into these awful cases that are so horribly traumatic and unjust and unfair. And that can be done in a whole variety of ways. As we look at data created, for example, within police departments, we can often identify troubling trends in an officer's performance relatively early in their career as they develop, more uses of force than officers working in peer assignments, and they build histories of civilian complaints that are not comparable with other officers working in like assignments. There's a whole variety of data points that we can look at that the chiefs may not be able to look at or may not have the bandwidth to look at, and we can say, here's where we think some organizational attention needs to be paid. You need to figure out what's happening with these individuals before they engage in one of these awful cases. And so it can be, of course, my role as independent monitor in Denver sometimes required me to issue reports to the community that were fairly stinging about issues and cases in Denver. But I viewed myself, notwithstanding those stinging critiques, I viewed myself as a partner, with the city and with the executives in the agency, pushing toward the same goal, which is improved policing and greater community trust built with that police department.
Thank you. So, Justin, you're equally on the front line, but you're sort of playing in a different battlefield. You're working in front of state legislatures, and coordinating even on a national level with developing policy, talking about reform, dealing with trends to try to deal with this on a broader level. Tell us what you're seeing. Tell us what's happening both in the legislative front here and maybe how that ties into some national efforts as well.
Absolutely, Penfield. I mean, I think that on the legislative front, there's been a visceral reaction across the board, right? The leadership of our state felt compelled to respond, to what's happening in the country, what's happening here in our own backyard, and had a responsibility and a duty to do so as elected officials. And so Colorado, of course, passed monumental legislation, 217, led by, Representative Leslie Herod, that really was a game changer for the rest of the nation, and it set the tone as a response. And I use that language very specifically, not a reaction, as a response to what we were seeing not only across the country with the concerns around the new interest that the public has highlighted around policing in our country and in our state, and not a reaction by literally setting precedents with the legislation around accountability here in Colorado, and of course, right here back in our own backyard regarding Elijah McClain and several others right in the past. It's not just subjected to Elijah McClain. There's been several others in the Denver metro area over the years in the last 2 decades where we've seen unfortunate incidents of excessive force or lethal force by law enforcement, especially in communities of color. So I think that has had a ripple effect nationally. We've seen across the country in huge states, right, that have been dealing with historical policing issues like you opened this up with, Penfield, Chicago, New Jersey, California, New York, various down south, Texas. A lot of these states are looking at this more in-depthly now from a policy standpoint to say, what do we need to evaluate, re-examine, and really truly identify at a legislative level? How does that translate down? I think what's important for the audience to understand is that it varies state by state, but here in Colorado, we're a home rule state. And what that translates to is that local jurisdiction applies to all 64 counties. So as state legislation and policy is passed, the counties at a local judicial level have discretion and authority to implement those policies. And so that's what we've been seeing, not only here at home in Colorado, but across the nation, is this wrestle with leadership at a policy level, at a state, at a legislative level, that are responding to the demand by the public for accountability, may do so, and also wrestle with if they are a state that's a home rule state, like Oregon, right? For example, that there's local control and local jurisdiction on the implementation of those policies. Then you get a little bit of a tug of war depending on the climate at a local level, depending on the political temperature at a local level, especially in states that are more conservative or have a historical disproportionate police misconduct predicated on history. So that, to me, I think is essential for the audience to really be thinking about, and not to limit the conversation. I think our state legislature was really put in a position to honestly ask the real question, and that is, what does public safety mean now? What is the interest of policing now? There has been a public shift. This is not new, right? We experienced this in the civil rights era. We've experienced this, especially communities of color, historically, like you highlighted. So it's not a new phenomenon. I think what's distinct this time is across the country is a multi-cultural interest for change, not a single cultural or ethnical interest for change. It is shared across the board. And so that, to me, has created the demand for our state legislatures or our legislatures across the country, our policymakers to have to respond, because this is what we elected them to do, to represent the interest of the people. And the interest of the people as it relates to how we police in this country and how we police in this state has significantly shifted. And that is where we're at, I think, at a policy level. Again, Colorado has led in that regard across the country, and it's led with headwinds. There's been significant blowback. Representatives and senators that passed that legislation have received death threats right here from our own constituents in this state, right? Have received extensive pushback from local law enforcement agencies, right? I mean, literally everything from hate mail to actual threats. So I highlight that example to say, although we're making some steps forward from a policy standpoint, not only here in Colorado, but across the country, there is a backlash. There is a constituency out there that does not want this change to occur. There's an old guard that says the interest historically and to now how policing is done is sufficient. But what we fail to fundamentally ask is, when we say public safety and when we think about policing, whose safety? And that's where I think policymakers are wrestling with this diverse, this equity, this inclusive way of looking at policing from a safety standpoint as it relates to everyone, and not special interest, not historical interest, because it's shifting. And that's the nudge that I'm seeing at a policy level that we are wrestling with, not only here in our state, but across the country.
Justin, you raise an interesting point. You're right. I think as a community, more people are stepping up and speaking out about this issue and wanting to see change and reform. Here locally, if you went down at the time of the protest around George Floyd, the vast majority of people walking and marching were not people of color. They were whites who were there in sympathy and acknowledging the gravity of the situation. And that's probably for a couple of reasons. You've talked about how this has changed. I would submit a big game changer has been one of the reform measures, which are body cams, because when you see the video, it's hard to dispute that. And the other big game changer is just social media. The fact that those young people were brave enough to stand there and videotape everything that happened to George Floyd in that encounter, and then put it out there for the entire world to see was a game changer, because it was really difficult for people to try to say, we don't have a problem, there's not an issue, when it's right there in front of you. But your comment also ties into a question we got from one of our viewers. And let me encourage viewers, as you're watching, please enter the chat, send us comments, send us questions. That's what we're here for, is to respond to these. So I think about the older woman, and I think it was Longmont, who suffered from dementia and left the store and was walking home, and a couple of officers there in her town confronted her and ended up either breaking her arm or dislocating her arm. And then they were fired because they joked about it with fellow officers after the fact. And the one of our viewers asked the question, how does this whole issue of reform and the need to change the relationship between community and police, what does that look like in communities that don't have large communities of color within them? There aren't a lot of Blacks or Latinos or other people of color, yet there is still this problem. What do we do? What's needed? Anyone, please weigh in.
Well, Penfield, if I may, I think just kind of piggybacking off of my earlier comments, right? What do we do in communities that are communities of non-color, that there's anecdotal incidents that occur, right? Let's acknowledge what's actual about that statement. One, it's anecdotal. It's not widespread. It's not consistent. It's not frequent, and it's not persistent. And we are clear on the historical interest of policing, protecting those specific communities. Now, it does not say that those things don't occur, because we have an example like Longmont. What do? Well, we need to look unilaterally across the board, which is what's happening right now in Colorado and across the country, at what does accountability for that behavior look like? That's the impetus of this particular session here, right? And secondly, when those anecdotal incidents happen in communities that are not communities of color, and the outcry is limited, that's an issue, because it has to be a shared outcry. It has to be a shared interest of, regardless if it's anecdotal or extremely, frequent historically and currently in communities of color, there has to be a unilateral demand to say no more, no matter what. And that, to me, is where I'm seeing we are at right now. We're at a pinnacle phase in this country and in our state that literally says this can no longer be the norm, regardless of who it happens to, with the caveat that we have to continue to acknowledge who it's historically happened to and why. And once we have that collective interest, whether it's Longmont, whether it's Denver, whether it's Aurora, whether it's, the Southern Plains, whether it's, the Western Slope, that collective interest that says no more, our taxpayer dollars won't be paid this way, we want accountability, then, and only then, will it no longer be anecdotal or disproportionate to one ethnicity or one group. It'll be universally saying, this is exactly what we want as far as policing moving forward. So to me, I think that's essential in reference to the Longmont example and how you address that to the audience member that asked that question of what about in situations like that, what do? They join. Allyship is important. Whether it's one case or 10 cases in Longmont of white people being harassed or excessively experiencing excessive force by police, what we're seeing across the board is this new this culture of excessive predatorial policing, period, regardless of what community. And we have to unite literally and say no more.
Well, and that's well and good, but I welcome other thoughts, but the reality is everybody in our community wants some sort of police presence. I mean, we all acknowledge crime exists. We don't want to be the victims of crime. We need someone to respond in those instances. Mm-hmm. So there is a balance here that we have to find that maybe we have lost. And I ask, we've had another one of our listeners who raised the question, and let me offer this to Vanessa. So do you change and accountability is fine, but let's talk about how we avoid these things. Do you change the culture of a force by changing how you recruit who become members of that force? Is there is that a place to begin to look to try to change what's happening on the street?
I think it definitely helps to make sure that we're hiring the right people. And so we have to have control mechanisms where we're making sure that we have vibrant background checks, vibrant psychological checks on officers, because the community is saying, yes, we need to be policed, and we're giving this ultimate power to be able to take someone's freedom and, God forbid, take their life. And and that's a necessity. Our community needs police. They need good police that they can trust and believe in, and know that when we show up, you're going to be treated the exact same, regardless of your gender, your race, your gender identity, whatever it may be. And so I think that's a start. I also think that we need to do better in training, and we need to stop. Officers are being attacked. Officers are losing their lives. It is very dangerous to be a police officer in America today. Hands down. I have officers I see, they're assaulted, attacked, spit on, you name it, every day. And so that is a reality. And we need to train them to be able to protect themselves. And when you hear they were in fear for their life, again, they're human beings. They do have fear. They have reactions. They have anger. They have, reactions to things that are presented to them. But we need to stop training just that everyone isn't out to kill us, and this us versus them mentality that can start to fester when there is, people criticizing, people spitting, attacking, these types of things. We've got to recognize that us versus them mentality if it's starting to happen. Address it with making sure we have vibrant wellness programs and psychological services for our officers. I am asking that all of my officers are mandated to go to at least one psychological check-in. I don't want to know, I'm not going to invade their privacy, but I want them to at least go and have that conversation and maybe recognize that this vicarious trauma, the things that they see on a day-to-day basis, which are horrific, is not starting to affect them, affect how they view the community, affect how they treat their families, affect how they treat just being a good human. And I think when people see, negative things over and over again, or people saying, F the police, or you're this, you're that, and the other thing, human beings are going to react defensively. And so recognizing that starts with getting the right people on the job, training them to realize that it's not us versus them. We need to be able for them to protect themselves, but we need to focus on the de-escalation, the verbal skills, the ability to build relationships within our community, and to just focus on those types of things, still being able to defend ourselves, still being able to make sure that we go home to our families every night, but to not have it be the first tool that we pull out is force. And it's going to take a while to change that culture shift, but everyone, I think, I was in a major city conference just last week as well as today, and we're having those conversations across the nation of how do we support our officers, because we need people to want to do this job still. This community, we've seen violent crime rise across the nation, and communities are being victimized. And we need to make sure that that our officers have the right tools. But what are those tools? Can we do different? Can we bring more humane tools to them to use? And I'll use this as an example. We've seen the hobble used across the nation, and it's known as a hog tie in many communities. And I've implemented what we call the WRAP system, which is a better and safer way to transport someone that's combative, where they actually sitting up. It almost looks like a human burrito, and they're sitting up. They can breathe. They're not, panicking. I don't know about you. I'm claustrophobic. And so if they're piling up on me and I'm laying flat on my stomach, my reaction, and I think a lot of people's reaction, would be to your body is reacting, and it's like fighting because you can't breathe, or you're having that mental moment. And so how do we do it better? What tools can we give officers? And what can we take off police officers' plates so that they shouldn't be responding to some of the issues of mental health crises. And of course, we're going to be needed in many of these situations when weapons are involved. But as a community, we need to do better, and we need to stop glorifying. I'm sorry, I'm just going to put it out there, glorifying bad behavior in TV shows and movies of police officers, and roughing up suspects and all these things that are, the action films. We need to stop it, and it's going to take a lot of people saying enough is enough. And I agree that it's time to say across the board, we need to treat people with dignity and respect. And the situation in Longmont for those officers, I had officers that I fired for mocking the Elijah McClain Memorial. I was sickened by it. I was also sickened by watching officers laugh at that elderly woman being injured. That is not acceptable, and they should not be wearing a badge.
Vanessa, I've talked to. I'm sorry, I interrupted someone. Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask if I could just make a quick 10-second comment real quick. And I just want to, with all due respect, I have a high regard and high respect for Chief Wilson. And so thank you for those comments. I do think it's essential, though, because the narrative around high crime rates, violent crime going up is perpetuated, right? It's the tough on crime, law and order narrative. And I think it's important for the audience to understand, although it be true, I'm not debating the fact that violent crime is not increased. But I think often we correlate violent crime with a law enforcement or criminal legal response. And that's where I think we limit ourselves as a community. When violent crime is happening and crime is happening in our communities, communities play a key role in the health and safety of their community. We can no longer continue to be solely reliant upon the criminal legal response to upticks in crime. And data will show and research will show, we know that law enforcement's role is primarily intervention with some prevention built into a model. So I think it's important for the audience to know the narrative of violent crime going up creates panic, it creates fear, and it signals law enforcement response. As a general practice, we have to be cognizant of our language. And I think, Penfield, you preferenced with that about language being important. Violent crime going up is our response is not solely law enforcement. Community plays a key role in the public and health and safety of the community. So I don't want the audience to hear this narrative, because it happens, it seems to me like every decade, every 10 years, there's this cycle of a narrative that crime is going up, violent crime is going up, and there's data that shows that, there's data that proves that. And yes, albeit true, our response as a community should not be solely reliant upon law enforcement, to Chief Wilson's point, right? There has to be a collective effort to create health and safety. And it's important that we start including the word health in safety, because safety has been synonymous with what I call the 3 C's: cops, courts, and cages. And we are still in a space over 40 years since the launch of the drug war that we're wrestling with police and community relations. So it is apparent that what we have been doing with what the community is demanding, society is demanding now, that we shape a new narrative of what we mean by public health and safety. And it's not a reliance upon LAEs, law enforcement agencies. It's community, and law enforcement is part of the community. There is no separation. So I just wanted to highlight that real quick, because I get concerned when I hear the perpetual narrative of violent crime is going up. Crime is going up. We need policing. Yes, there is a role for policing. The conversation we're having as a nation and as a state is, what is that role? What is the
and I think that's the important point, and that's the why of this conversation. Yeah. We know there is an issue. I don't think anybody on this panel is saying there's no problem out there that doesn't need to be addressed. The question is, how do we change the culture? How do we change things to get to where we need to be, and what do we do? You know, when I look at some of the comments from some of our viewers, one person asked directly, what other things can be done to change the culture? You talk about culture, another viewer said, you know, I worked in psych and got spit on regularly, but I never killed anyone. Again, saying that just because of how you're treated, you have to act and respond in a different way. Others are asking, do neighborhood watch programs work? Are they effective to help support police and build more accountability, both with community and in police forces? And how can we, to your point, Justin, what reform do we need to see so that all of us can help and support officers and be part of the solution to get, I think your point was health and safety without unnecessary physical violence, loss of life, and confrontation? Is it just training? Is it just more diverse police forces? What do we need? Where do we need to go with this?
I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I will put it up to the panel. I have a response, but I definitely want to make sure I yield to my astounding colleagues who I got.
All right, so I'm just gonna do this.
I do have a response.
You said you deal with a number of individual cases. And so you typically deal with matters where it has become so egregious or problematic that the only way to get recourse for that individual is to pursue the court system, the justice system. But based on the cases you've seen, what could have been done differently that seem to be common sense reforms that ought to be talked about and considered?
None of these questions are easy, right? If we had if there were answers to these questions, we wouldn't be doing these panels. But I guess I can share observations that I have had over the many, many years I've been a civil rights attorney. And Chief Wilson and Justin certainly touched upon some of this. And one of them is that I just think we expect too much from officers. And Chief Wilson said it as we need to take things off the plate, right? You know, we have officers who are trained to run into King Soopers when there is an active shooter. And we as a community expect that. Without hesitation, sir, officer, I know that you've got a Glock on you and this man's got an AR-15. You need to run towards AR-15, right? And this is now the same person that we are trying to expect to de-escalate, talk down, work in mental health crises, those are experiencing homelessness. And sometimes the reform, I believe, is that we just need different types of responders to different situations. And we do lip service to it. Yes, we're going to hire some social workers and some nurses to come in and work with some mental health crises, those experiencing mental health crises. And that's the start of the conversation. But until law enforcement is going to embrace, the prototypical Marine look, SWAT officer look, which there's probably some use for, but then also embrace our senior citizens becoming part of law enforcement. Until we can start looking at that, where community and the diversity of community is reflected in law enforcement. And that's just got to be the answer, is that law enforcement agencies just need to look like the beautiful messiness and diversity that exists in our communities. I'm not just talking racial diversity. Let's hire some Black men and Black women and things like that. No, I'm talking about those that have disabilities, those that have also had substance abuse issues, those that have also experienced homelessness. That, until we start increasing the breadth of who we expect what we expect law enforcement to look like, we're not going to see change, because the reality here is we can talk about the role of police, right? But we expect police to do everything. And so we need to then have enough people and the diversity of people to do everything, right? And we can talk about, we use these examples of like, even Elijah, Longmont, these are difficult issues, because I'm sure the police chief in Longmont was like, these folks did everything that we told them not to do. Everything that we have done from day one of academy to ongoing education has told them, please don't break grandma's arm, right? What can you do with that? What can be learned, right? Sure, there might have been things in their hiring. Sure, there might be a culture of brutality, things of that nature, sure. But at the end of the day, it's still just extreme violence of one individual in that situation. What can we learn from that? I think what we have to look at is other things. Like, how do we we need to judge issues related to, I don't know. I think the Kyle Vinson is a much more interesting conversation that we can have. Kyle Vinson was the Aurora, the officers got charged immediately and he was homeless, and we call it the pistol whipping incident, right? And so now we can have conversations about how are we going to address those who are experiencing homelessness, substance abuse. Why are our officers losing patience of that nature, right? And so now we're having conversations about evaluations, breaks, I don't know, paying people better. That is probably a great start for law enforcement. Let's start removing some of the stressors that officers may have in their lives. They're behind on child support. Their kids are in college and they can't, they're having to work extra shifts and secondary moonlighting and whatnot. Those are the kinds of things. So I think, so that's my long way of saying, until law enforcement fundamentally changes, where we embrace not just nurses, not just social workers, but all folks, right? That we can have a law enforcement that mirrors the community, that gives Chief Wilson the necessary tools to say, I'm going to utilize the resources of the Aurora Police Department in this way, right? So when you have a disturbance call at a senior citizen center, or you have the 37th call for trespass of this public space, she's not sending tactically trained SWAT officers to those situations. She's got other options. So I think that's the answer. We need to give Chief Wilson more options to deal with the complicated issues of our community, which includes violent crime.
Now, and you make a good point, Kisera, because I spoke to the mayor of another suburban community that said that their police force is now beginning to incorporate social workers as part of the resources available to the police department, so that based on calls they get, as they triage the calls when they come in, it may not just be an officer that goes out to respond, but someone who's got some other training in another discipline that goes out to look and see if there's a way to address the situation, diffuse it, and to bring some resolution without creating the confrontation that sometimes just is automatic when someone with a weapon steps out of a car and walks to address the situation. So it sounds like you're saying that's part of what we need to see also as part of this effort. But here's a big question, and Nick, you may have more familiarity with this. If this is part of the solution, how do you get the policymakers, the mayors, the city council people to understand that you can't just fund a police department with tactically trained people? You need to fund it and staff it with a whole host of other people in other disciplines if you really want to keep a community safe and have law and order maintained as well.
I do think that is a key question, because when we look at police reform over the years, and really police management, we see a lot of sort of delegation. We see a lot of communities that have been told that they're a group of experts, policing leaders or city managers or mayors who should be in charge of, or city councils, setting the police budget, determining priorities for the criminal justice system. And communities have in many ways been sort of assured that they could stand down and leave it to the experts to set those kinds of key priorities. And I think what we've seen in recent years particularly after George Floyd's murder, but I think it began sooner than that, was a recognition that maybe on some of these kind of normative questions about how should we organize our criminal justice system, maybe it's not sufficient to just delegate those kinds of decisions to the experts. And so we've seen communities around the country begin to develop different ways of exerting some sort of democratic control over those kinds of decisions about criminal justice. We've seen in Denver, of course, there was a task force created to reconsider the way that public safety services are delivered. And they produced a very useful, lengthy report making a whole series of recommendations to be considered by the mayor and the city council and the police chief. There have been other efforts like that around the country, and other ways to begin to, I guess, building off of Cuser's point, to democratize, if you will, the delivery of policing services or delivery of services in general at the ground level. There needs to be some kind of increasing sort of democracy at the decision-making level as well. And so some of that comes from these community-led efforts to assume some of those responsibilities that have historically been taken by policing leaders. Some of it, frankly, just comes through the democratic process. Traditionally in Denver and in many cities, policing issues, criminal justice issues get some amount of attention, but people don't vote based on criminal justice issues, usually. There are certainly plenty of exceptions to that rule. People don't hold their political leadership accountable associated with these kind of big systemic issues in the justice system. And I think we've seen that begin to change in America. We've seen more persistent engagement from communities. We've seen more accountability on municipal politicians and other politicians. I think those are healthy trends that will only help improve the quality of decision making about these kinds of issues we're talking about here tonight in political leadership around the country.
Yeah, and I think we as a community and as a broader society have to be willing to try some of these things. I mean, one of our viewers made a note that North Minneapolis is playing out an amazing community policing model every day. I'm not familiar with that, but as more cities like North Minneapolis and others try things that are effective and work, that it encourages other communities to do likewise. Is anyone here familiar with what's going on in North Minneapolis? I'm just curious.
I am not,
Nope.
unfortunately.
Okay. Maybe too new of an effort then. Maybe too
Yeah,
new of an
it could be worth absolutely researching, right? And just kind of seeing and reaching in, right? I do believe each state learns from each other, right? And Penfield, I want to piggyback off of what Nick was saying too, in reference to policymakers and how do we get them to support reform and actual investment. And to Nick's point, right? I think over the last decade, the appetite for criminal legal system reform, and I want to be really clear, I say criminal legal system and not criminal justice system because it's not just. But I think that the appetite for policy development and policy changes has grown, and the appetite for the electorate voting on those types of issues or wanting someone that represents their interest has grown. I think two ways. I think elected officials have to understand. Let me back that up. 3 ways. Elected officials have to understand that they're representing their constituents, and if the constituents' issue is for this reform, then they stand to not be reelected. They also stand to be recalled. And I'd say the third part of that too is understanding the who's all involved when we think about elected officials getting on board with policies that support reform, right? This is not a single vacuum issue. Police accountability is directly attached to DA accountability, district attorneys, prosecutors. It's directly attached to independent monitors. It's directly attached to fraternal orders of police, right? Police unions. This is not in a vacuum. We can't have a limited view of thinking about police accountability from a defund or a reform or a transform without talking about the other system actors that are involved, right? Because these are local budgets, these are municipal budgets that they all play a subsequent role. and they're elected officials. DAs are elected officials in our state. Most voters don't know. We have 22 judicial districts. All of them elect their district attorney, right? Well,
To further your point, in a lot of states, not in Colorado, in a lot of states, judges are elected. Our
correct.
judges
Yes.
stand
Yes.
for retention, but they
Right.
don't. You've got some states where judges actually get elected in the office, sometimes based on how they've ruled on controversial cases. So that is also an issue. But so Justin, I take your point, but let me put this to you. We started out by talking about the fact that Chief Wilson is trying to bring about reform, and she's had two of her unions take votes of no confidence because she's trying to reflect the will of the community. And thankfully, I saw some of the other elected and appointed officials in Aurora. They had her back and they said, nope, she's doing exactly what we brought her here to do. And we're going to continue to support her doing that. But so, Justin, how do you bring about this reform? How do we have the conversation with those currently in law enforcement? There needs to be accountability. There need to be more tools made available. But the place where reform needs to happen, how do we get the officers in blue to acknowledge and accept the fact that reform is necessary and important so that they can get, I think someone said this earlier, the support and the respect of the community so that they're more effective in doing their work? And not just Justin, anybody weigh in there, because it seems to me that's part of the dynamic here as well.
Well, I think that if we take out the politicizing of it, right, and don't go party ideology, the first and foremost thing is, and this could be perceived as a little foo-foo, but really shifting the narrative with officers around their association to the word reform, right? What is that? How does that land? How does it resonate with them? Taking out of the political context, right? We're not talking progressive or conservative. We're not talking any of that. We're saying when officers hear the concept or context of reform, how does that resonate? What does that mean, right? If it lands as threatening, i.e. to the point of what Chief Wilson was saying earlier, and also I believe Cusar, and that is officers who have dedicated their career, they went to school, they built their families, they got kids going to college, like all of these things are the identity of an officer, right? And when officers hear reform, what do they hear? I think that's fundamentally a starting point to say that conversation. What do they hear? The listening circles of officers and understanding what they hear. Chief Wilson has to hear it every day, right? She's running an entire police force, but the community doesn't, right? So that to me is mitigating this adversarial nature. The second thing is,
hang on. So let me cut you off for a second.
Absolutely.
Because I want to bring in another perspective. So Nick, you were right there at the intersection of law enforcement and community in your role as the independent monitor. What did you hear from, you dealt with a number of officers also. What did you hear from them when they were faced with community outcries for change, reform, accountability? What was there anything that you heard or saw where the officers were saying, you're right, we've got to do some things differently, or we need help here or there? What did they seem receptive to?
Yeah, well, I heard a lot of fear, to be honest with you. I heard a lot of, fear about unfamiliar, scary changes. I heard, officers they do have a tough job and can engage in some almost catastrophic thinking where if you make X change to our practices or our policies, then all of these terrible things will happen. If you change our force policy in the following 3 ways, you're going to have cops getting hurt, cops getting injured, our jobs are going to become more challenging. So I think, and I'm certainly no expert, I'm not a police officer, but I've spent lots and lots of time talking to cops about these issues. I think the biggest impediment is fear and breaking through that kind of fear barrier. it's incredibly uncomfortable. I can't even imagine the experience that Aurora police officers are having right now as they go through this, time of crisis and scrutiny and attention, indictments, attorney general reports, public criticism. None of that can be comfortable. All of that has to be disorienting, unpleasant. And so, I think getting through the fear, I'd be interested in Chief Wilson's opinion, but breaking through the fear to some extent means, talking about getting through that catastrophic thinking. And reform doesn't mean you're not going to be safe. Reform doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to defend yourself if your life is in jeopardy. Reform doesn't mean that your job is going to become worse. Reform, in many ways means your job will be better. You will enjoy increased credibility in the community that you patrol. You'll enjoy better relationships, increased public perception of the credibility of the work that you do. And so breaking through that fear barrier, I think, is incredibly important to, bringing police officers and police departments into this discussion and figuring out how to sort of partner on, some of these solutions, because it can't just sort of come, to make any kind of change or reform sustainable, it has to come certainly, with influence from the outside, with legal tools can be brought to bear, as we've seen in Aurora and in other places. Community can be brought to the table, but it also needs to come from inside. There needs to be buy-in from within the ranks. And from my perspective, a lot of that has to do with breaking through that fear and catastrophic thinking about what reform means and what it actually is in practice.
Well, and Vanessa, you're living it every day. How do you do that? How do you talk to your officers? How do you, and can you help them understand, I think to Nick's point, that reform doesn't mean you're going to be less safe, that reform doesn't mean you're going to be less effective. It means you'll be safer and more effective because you have an entire community sort of wrapping their arms around you and embracing you. But we just got to figure out what the role is you play and how you play it. How do you communicate that?
So I think that that Nick hit a lot of points of the fear of change, of the fear of, the loss of qualified immunity. Is my house going to be, am I going to be sued? Am I going to lose my livelihood? My children, my family is going to be affected. And, when we talk about what Aurora specifically has been through, it has been 22 months of being in the headlines, national media, national news, and then the repercussions of that for actions of officers that I have fired, that I've held accountability, and I think very many. I'm in the 20s at this point. But I stand behind each one of those terminations. But every time I have to terminate someone, it causes fear of, am I next? And so communication, I need to do a better job of it, of letting them know, as long as you're doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons, and you're policing with integrity and constitutionality, then you're safe. But their family sees it. Their family sees, the negative perception of law enforcement, which a lot of times is deserved for the atrocities that we have seen across the nation that have happened. And so, but at the same time, I need to do a better job of figuring out how to communicate to my police department that you are needed, that you are respected by the community, and there are good police officers within our ranks. It's just that, the media coverage of everything is heightened. Anything Aurora Police is going to make national news. CNN is calling on something that truly is going across, and this is no excuses, but is happening across the nation. But Aurora Police is, that's a headline. And so they're living that experience day in and day out. And not only are they living it, their families are living it, their kids are living it. They're questioning, their kids are seeing social media and negativity about what police officers are. They're murderers, they're racists, they're all these things. And their families and friends are starting to question, why are you doing this job? Are you that? And that's psychologically very damaging on these officers.
Vanessa, we talked a minute ago about how, as a community, we sort of have a responsibility to one another just not to make random he or she looks suspicious calls and start a cascade of events. So what do we as a community, how can the community partner with our police force to make sure you and the other chiefs have what you need to make and bring about this positive reform for the community within your departments? What do you need from us?
I, that's a good question. I think we need resources. We need you vocalizing what it is that you do want us to do and don't want us to do, and then when we do it right, acknowledging that we're doing it right, and acknowledging that we're making changes. And I think you and I had a conversation prior to this evening of where I said, I am going to have accountability in my agency. I'm going to hold officers accountable, but each mistake is not a fireable offense, and each mistake can be sometimes with training. And I need the community to take a pause and even though allow me to reform the agency through training, through changing the mindset of from the warrior, everyone's out to kill you, to communicators, to having empathy, to slowing things down, to those types of things, and making sure I'm hiring the right individuals. But that's what I need. I think is the call for reform has been heard loud and clear, and I'm doing it as best we can. And I think with the city management, the state legislators, the officers, and I just want you to let you know, when you talk about the unions, I've had many officers say to me, we appreciate what you're doing, because they're proud of this uniform and they're proud of this patch, even though it's been, stained with some horrible incidents. It's still one that they're proud to wear, because they're doing it because they truly believe in this profession and they truly do want to help people. And the ones that don't, I'll deal with.
Phil, may I add something?
Sure.
An earlier point that Chief Wilson made, I think, is important in addition to how to help and support, right? And I think it's also holding other elected officials and former elected officials accountable to the reform narrative. Currently right now, we have a former district attorney of Judicial District 18, which covers Arapahoe Aurora, literally doing editorial and op-eds in the Denver Post as an editor, saying that reform is making us all unsafer, including police officers. So when you have a former elected official who represented law enforcement at a district attorney level, signaling through op-eds to officers that reform is making them less safe and making our communities less safe, that's that narrative. That's that pressure of media that Chief Wilson was talking about. And so it's allowing Chief Wilson to internally do what she needs to do in supporting her, but also as a community holding other elected officials accountable that perpetuate these narratives that make it even tougher for a Chief Wilson or a Chief Payson or any of the chiefs, right? Like we have to be cognizant as a community when we're watching other elected officials who sit in these positions or former elected officials who have access to a narrative that literally perpetuate, reform is making it more dangerous. Reform doesn't work. Reform is making officers less safe. And yet we're having champions like Chief Vanessa saying, wait, give me a chance. These are other elected officials or former elected officials. So there's a responsibility there too.
Well, sure there is, but I mean, we all have to acknowledge, in this country, everybody's entitled to their own opinion. And we know that no matter what happens or no matter what atrocities occur, there are going to be some who believe that reform is just totally off the table, that it's the fault of the person who was injured or killed or the suspected perp. And, they shouldn't have been in that situation. You're not going to change the minds of those people. But I think the vast majority of people in this community believe we have an issue, we need to address it. And I think they want to be part of the solution of figuring out how to bring about constructive, positive change so they live in desirable, safe, healthy communities, because they have people who have their back and they have the officers' back. So in my time in the legislature, when we would deal with these issues, people were sometimes surprised by my attitudes on things. And I used to tell them, I had 3 uncles who were police officers. And they used to tell me that what made them most effective was when the community knew they were there to support them and help them and keep them safe. And in turn, the community kept them safe by letting them know what was going on around them. So they were always aware of what sort of environment they were working in. We need that symbiotic relationship again. We need to get back to that. And I think to Vanessa's point and to what Nick was also saying, and just into your point, we as a community, we need to figure out how to help those who serve not be afraid of change that needs to happen. And I guess that sort of and so with that, let me just offer, in addition to some of the things we've talked about, and I'm going to go to a couple other audience questions in a moment. What other reform do we need? I mean, Nick, does every city need an independent monitor?
Well, I'm not going to make a big pronouncement about what every city in America needs. Certainly, every city needs to develop mechanisms to, there have been a number of comments about accountability. Every city needs to develop mechanisms, whether internal or external, to thoroughly and competently look into allegations of excessive force or abuse by police officers. Full stop. I think that can take a variety of forms. I think independence is very good, is important for those mechanisms, and probably every major city in America should have a monitor of some kind or some external mechanism to do that. But again, there's no one size fits all solution or approach. Every community is different. History of each police department with each community, it varies. So I think that is that it again, it's kind of a case by case evaluation for each city.
And I'm curious, let me just throw this out, and one of our listeners actually raised this issue. It's another way for officers to be part of the community. Denver used to have a residency rule, and it was done away with some years ago. And I think for a host of reasons it was a mistake. But what I remember was years ago, my next door neighbor was a young officer in the Denver police force, a Black man, who's risen to the rank of division chief now. And it was a very interesting environment. You knew you better have your tags current and not do anything crazy in the neighborhood, but there was actually a feeling of comfort of knowing he was right there, and he drove his squad car home at night. So there was a police car parked on the street, and it sort of signaled to everybody, this neighborhood's kind of covered. This block is covered. We've got someone here we can talk to. And neighbors used to walk up and let him know when stuff was going on, and he would take a look at some things. Is that what we need? Do we need more of our officers to actually perhaps maybe live in the precincts they patrol or the areas where they serve in police?
You directing that to me, or just throwing that open to the panel?
Anybody. We're throwing it out to anybody. We're talking about ideas. What needs to happen differently?
Well, I don't know if I agree. I mean, I would hope that a police officer doesn't have to live in the neighborhood about the neighborhood that they're been assigned to,
Okay.
So I understand the residency requirement for Denver. I think to answer the question from my perspective of how we can support a law enforcement agency, this, just because Nick Mitchell is here, I'm not just saying it. I think the term independent monitor does not do justice to what the independent monitor's office actually does. What I have found, because respectfully, as we're trying to grapple with the issues related to Aurora, I think it's apparent, and I mean all respect to Chief Wilson, I don't think she fully understands the full extent of the problems in order to proffer solutions, right? She's inherited a situation. And what I have found as I sort of watched the independent monitor progress through Denver, was some of the more impressive things that I liked about the independent monitor was the data-driven suggestions, where a lot of a lot of what the independent monitor does of analyzing trends, arrest trends, national police trends, we can talk about things like shooting into cars, for example. I have found that nerds like Nick Mitchell, who are not law enforcement, who sometimes gets unfairly criticized, hey, you're not a cop, how can you tell us what to do? I think that what I saw Nick Mitchell accomplish in Denver was more of a partnership. And what, of course, no one likes it when the independent monitor sticks their nose into disciplinary recommendations. No one likes it when really ugly excessive force is looked at more and more and more, and independent monitors often do that. But what Nick Mitchell's office also did was they would find, and this is one of the most frustrating parts about my job, is I would see law enforcement agencies, different law enforcement agencies in Colorado, do the same mistakes because they don't learn from other law enforcement agencies' problems. They take the position of, oh, that would never happen to us here in Greenwood Village because we're not Aurora, right? And so I don't need to learn from the Elijah McClain incident because that would never happen in Greenwood Village, right? And I think that it just becomes a matter of time. And that's what I found independent monitors offices actually do, compiling national trends. I think that we don't need to have, if we don't learn from George Floyd, because we don't think it would happen here, that would be a mistake, right? But how many law enforcement agencies in Colorado actually changed any of the business they do because of what happened to George Floyd? And the answer is very few. And so some of the best things we can do, and Chief Wilson may not like it, is provide a well-funded, independent, I'm just going to call you a partner, who can provide some of the gaps in the data, gaps in the knowledge, and realistically, people who are being paid to do things that Aurora Police does not have the capacity to do. I'm sure Chief Wilson would love to do analysis on every neighborhood and the contacts and use of force complaints and discourtesy complaints, which shifts of which neighborhoods, of which bars are getting the most discourtesy complaints. Where are my officers drawing weapons more? Where are we taking medical, right? I'm sure Chief Wilson would love that because she's got a very finite amount of resources to handle a really, really big city. And folks like Nick Mitchell are really good at that, the data nerds. And I think that that is just the first step is stop resisting independent monitors, but let's not call Nick Mitchell a monitor or oversight because he's got no power in the world to do anything, right? He's got no oversight ability. All he can do is make sensible recommendations based on objective data. And I think Aurora has grown so fast and their community is so diverse and so complicated that the police force really hasn't kept up with the changing community. And I'm hoping that the introduction of an independent monitor office that looks something like Denver, but not entirely like Denver, will become that additional data-driven tool for Chief Wilson to figure things out. It becomes a little easier for you.
Well, I will say that I'm ready for the independent monitor to come in. It's nothing that I'm going to be, I think it's needed. I really do. And I believe because the community is not going, the community should be a part of looking at it. We have opened the doors, dropped the walls, come on in and look. And what you see that is wrong, let us know. And then we will try to change our practices to make sure that we're policing the way people want to be policed. And so I do embrace an independent monitor coming in. I really do. And the other thing I want to say is, the community has to have some say in discipline. I would love to see that as well, because what I think may be appropriate, as much as I try to be progressive, as much as I try to really embrace reform and listen to what the community is saying, I've been a law enforcement officer for 27 years. I look through the lens of a law enforcement officer. And I can't change that at this point in my life at 53 years old. So I need the community's eyes on this. And so I welcome it.
Interesting point. Well, let me ask the data nerd. What do you think about QSAR's recommendations?
Well, this is now the third time I've been called a nerd in the last 3 minutes. So, but I'm not offended. I'm not. It's actually pretty true. No, I think QSAR is right about the value of data. Paired with, there's national data generated about policing and when it works and when it doesn't work. There's also data within, each police department that can be incredibly revealing about problems that need to be addressed by management. I think, I'm sure the chief has, resource constraints that, make it difficult for her to analyze and mobilize all of that data. And I think she also rightly points out that there's a lens, there's a filter that all of us can have when we grow up in a particular profession. Notwithstanding the fact that I'm a nerd and a data nerd, I'm a lawyer by trade and training, and that is a lens that, we all have. Maybe this kind of circles back to a point that was made very early on. We all have biases and filters that we view the world through. And the chief talked about implicit biases. Certainly there are professional cultural biases as well that make it very difficult, I think, for policing executives sometimes to identify the problems in their department, and officers who are struggling to deliver policing services the way they should be delivered. Those kind of biases make it very hard for police executives to impose discipline when discipline should be imposed. Again, that's a kind of a generalization that, there are many exceptions to that rule, but I've seen it often enough in police departments around the country where when you have a department that opens up and says, not only do we welcome other perspectives, we need other perspectives, because we know that we don't, our filters may be getting in the way, may be causing us to view this case, this use of force in a way that is, different than the way it would be perceived by the community that we police. It may be causing us to interpret the actions of the so-called suspect in a way that may not be entirely consistent with the behavior that he or she was actually displaying. I think that openness to the perspective of an outside monitor and the community, and those are two different things, can be incredibly important in establishing the conditions that allow real reform to happen inside that police department.
Okay. Good point. Let me pose another question for all of the panel, and I'm going to paraphrase a comment we got from one of our other viewers, Keith. Is this issue with policing and the need for reform? I think Keith is saying it's not just a racial issue, but it's a socioeconomic issue also. That people who are less well off tend to be more frequently the victims of excessive force complaints and end up fatalities in interactions with police. Nick, I don't know what the data suggests here. Maybe you have some sense of this, or Vanessa, maybe you have some sense of this. Let's talk about that point Keith has raised.
Keith is correct. Yeah, I mean, Keith is right.
There are sociological, there are economic, there are geographic factors that play in to who has the most interaction with police. And of course, if you have more interaction, you're more likely to end up in a bad interaction with police officers. Certainly class and, access to, to money, access to indoor space, right? If you're out, if you don't have access to indoor space and you're out in the street more often, you're in a position in which you may have, more interactions with police officers that may be negative interactions. I think economic position certainly plays a role in that calculus, and I think going back to some points that Justin has raised, when we think about safety, we also need to think about health, and health and safety, also encompasses social capital and economic resources and all of those issues that he's already talked about. So yeah, I think economic position certainly deserves a place in this conversation.
Sarah, then Vanessa. Go ahead, Sarah.
Keith is right in the sense that what I think many casual observers see of law enforcement is they get uncomfortable with the amount that law enforcement enforce the expectations associated with capitalism, right? And how much property crimes, property value impacts law enforcement. A suspicious person walking through Cherry Hills versus a suspicious person walking through Five Points, right? I mean, the reaction to the Cherry Hills guy is going to be the entire police force is coming out, right? And in 5 Points, maybe no police officer comes out at all, right? And so it's some of that, and it is one of the fundamental issues that require addressing culturally. Is why do we respond to property crimes in the way we do? Why do we shoot at cars that are running away? Right? What are we accomplishing with that? So it's an issue of prioritizing resources, but it does go to actual cultural shifts. And I've seen it time and time again. When police officers start becoming private security, when they start enforcing the property rights of rich property owners, and then the disdain that they treat those who are experiencing homelessness, you start putting it together. It feels like it's the private security force of rich white people, right? And in certain communities, that's what police are. And that needs to change.
So I agree with what has already previously been said. And I will tell you that I am pushing hard against things like responding to homeless camps, responding to a person experiencing homelessness outside of a business. The communities that consider this to be unsightly and nuisance, and these are human beings. And a lot of these individuals that are experiencing homelessness have either drug, alcohol addiction, or living with mental illness. And that is ripe for a negative interaction with law enforcement. And we should not be the people that are expected to go deal with that. And so, I think that the community has to change their expectations. And I mean, look at all the debate over homelessness and who should be doing what, and not in my neighborhood and not in front of my business. And these people need to be moved along. And then they want the police to come in and be that negative enforcer. And yeah, I agree.
Well, if I may, Phil, I'd say, I agree. Absolutely. I mean, without a shadow of a doubt, socioeconomics matter. It's just legacy continuing its cycle, right? The origins and the impetus of policing was to protect, white privilege property. And here we are having the conversation in 2021, the exact same thing. So we know, like, this legacy has permeated. It's in the fabric of the structure of policing. That is, it's like a cancer. So yes, absolutely. Secondly, we know that policing impoverished communities and neighborhoods is standard practice because it often correlates with crime. But, I want to highlight something Qsar said earlier. And I think this is vitally important, and Chief Wilson said it as well. What we have to think about when you think about homeless camps and policing of poor communities is we over-criminalize everything. What would it look like for law enforcement agencies across the state of Colorado and the country to start challenging and questioning why certain things are a crime? We hear that outcry all the time that being homeless is not a crime, but yet it's treated as such. because you have loitering, you have all these things. And I piggyback off of what Qsar said earlier, that we put officers in positions to do everything. Well, they have to respond by duty, by law, because it's considered a crime. We over criminalize everything, and then the impacts of that are communities that are impoverished, socioeconomic deprived desert communities, to where now you have a heavy police presence. I don't know about you guys, but I grew up here in Denver. I'm a native. I came through the summer of violence of the 90s. I grew up northeast in Montbello. I lived through, literally for 5 years of my life, watching the community literally have 2 officers on every corner, every single corner, literally, right? So when you think about, and at that time, economically speaking, the Northeast area was one of the low economic, socioeconomic areas to live in Denver at that time. It's not by coincidence. So I just think that absolutely the viewer was right. To Qsar's point, we put officers in a position that's super tough because they're having to police everything that's criminalized, and we're not having the core conversation of how we're over criminalizing everything and putting officers in a position where they have to respond to everything, right? And to me, it makes no sense. It makes no sense to me.
Okay, I apologize. I got dropped out there, and we are nearing the end of our time. So let's do this. Let me give everybody a couple minutes to sort of wrap up, and then I'll have some closing comments. And I know Adrian wants to say a couple things. Nick, let's start with you. Give us your thoughts, a couple minutes to wrap up.
Well, you know, I would just echo, I think there have been some very good points made tonight about the importance of accountability, including external oversight for reforming police departments, having police leadership like Chief Wilson, who are willing to go against the grain sometimes when it's necessary in order to make the changes that may not be internally popular, but may be necessary. And then I would also sort of emphasize, the role of the sort of community in setting policing policy and in determining the way in which policing should be delivered in our communities. I think those are some key changes that, if they're pursued, throughout our state and our country, would have a tremendously useful effect on the relationship of police departments and communities of color in our state and in our country. Thanks for the opportunity to be on the panel with you tonight.
Thank you, Nick. Chief?
So first of all, I just want to thank you for bringing me to the table and having this conversation and having these tough discussions and all of us being open to different viewpoints. I think that we need accountability, and we also need the support of officers within being able to be there when you need us and not be there when you truly don't need us. And I saw some comments in the chat about how we're not funding. We've taken away the funding for things like homelessness and mental health, and the community needs to put the money back into those things, and so that the individuals are getting the help that they need. But again, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Justin?
I echo. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me on the panel. I mean, it's an honor to be on the panel with you guys. I have a great deal of respect for all of you, and so I think that, these are the critical conversations that we're having right now here in Colorado and across the nation, because we're at a crossroads. And I can't emphasize enough. I think what's being challenged is the narrative around what does public safety mean to folks, and what is the public interest, and how do we perceive public health and safety. And I think there's core questions and conversations that dig deeper than just police accountability, right? It is a nexus to the conversation of the responsibility of the criminal legal system. It is a nexus to the conversation of the responsibility of the interaction with community. And honestly, we're having a power conversation. The power dynamic shifting to saying the public interest is shifted to, this is what we perceive public health and safety to be. And what is the role of policing? What is the role of prosecution? What is the role of confinement? What is the role of supervision? These are all interrelated. It's not in a vacuum. And I think that's what's happening right now. I think it's warranted. I think the time is now, whether we call it reform, whether we call it change, whether we call it transformation, reimagining, whatever the buzzword may be. What we are faced with is something has to give, because this has, to me, bottomed out at the very fabric of the health and safety of our community. And it's going to take all of us. It's going to take law enforcement. It's going to take community members. It's going to take criminal legal system actors. It's going to take lawyers. It's going to take civil rights attorneys. It's going to take pastors, former legislators. It's going to take that level of engagement and investment in order for us, like Yusar was saying earlier, to see any real change. But I'm optimistic. I'm constantly optimistic, but I'm optimistic because I think right now we're at a point in time where Penfield, we have no choice. Chief Wilson, we have no choice. Nick, we have no choice. And we know this. And I think folks are recognizing that. So I just thank you again for the opportunity to spend some time with you guys and share my perspective. It's limited in its view, but it's my perspective. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Kisar.
Well, I'll start by saying thank you for organizing this really wonderful discussion, and thank you for Chief Wilson again. It's a little easier for us on this side. You're literally on the hot seat, and I think you've conducted yourself admirably. You've got a very difficult job, and you've been answering some tough questions, and that's what we should expect from all police chiefs. And you're one of the few that actually do it. So thank you. And I'll just finish where Justin started. Is we're talking about whatever the buzzword is. I think there's a lot of folks who are probably listening to this, and every time we said the word reform, they chuckle, right? You look at the Longmont situation, and you're like, that cannot be reformed. That's just fundamentally broken, or it's fundamentally working exactly the way it's designed to, right? One or the other. And I think we need to honor that some of this is beyond change, that it's just actually doing what it was intended to do. And until we're prepared to completely reimagine the role of law enforcement, and we acknowledge that we expect law enforcement to do everything, we want all roles to be filled, we're not going to be able to come up with real answers here. And so I think there's been incredible ideas that's been floated, and I'm glad Chief Wilson was listening to this, because you're the person who gets to implement some of these ideas. And so thank you for listening to the conversation, Chief, hearing these various stakeholders. And the final point is, all of our recent law enforcement or changes that have come from the legislature, I feel, have been much more with a deterrent effect. We're trying to deter poor behavior now by law enforcement. Let's criminalize. Let's make it really expensive. We'll sue the crap out of them. Maybe if the police unions and the police departments just pay enough money, they will stop doing what they're doing. And just like criminal justice, we've learned deterrent effects don't actually result in meaningful change. It doesn't impact behavior in the moment. And so while I think that these were knee-jerk, some of them are Band-Aids, we need to get down to the real issues of why issues like Kyle Vinson happened. Why, even after the wake of Elijah, police officers would go out there and create mocking pictures, right? And no amount of criminalizing police conduct or civil liability is going to answer those questions as to why. And until we get to the why, it doesn't matter. We're going to put police officers in cages. They're going to write big checks, and nothing is going to change. So, thank you.
Well, let me thank all of our panelists and our audience for being here with us. And before I turn it over to Adrian, just a couple of things. One, I want to read a comment from one of our viewers that is sort of a final idea to consider. This is from Martha Ray. I've been a child protection case worker in the recent past and am now a crisis counselor. In both of those arenas, our clients overlap with law enforcement, but we get no vests, no weapons, no anything but our listening ears and the ability to de-escalate to the best of our abilities. No one has died directly after an interaction with me and my treatment of them. I propose certifications and licensure that involve academics be part of the accountability equation. Another thing to consider. And finally, this from one of our other viewers. From someone we all know, Omar Montgomery. The Aurora branch of the NAACP is encouraged by the changes Chief Wilson is making towards transparency and accountability. We look forward to working with community partners and Chief Wilson to build community trust. We must work together, all stakeholders, to create systemic change within the City of Aurora's public safety system. I think it's probably well said. And I will just close with this as we thank everyone. I talked about the fact that America has a difficult history in this area, that law enforcement or policing started from a bias of wanting to control people of different colors and of socioeconomic standing. Policing and race and class were linked. And it's only by virtue of the conversation we've had tonight and some of the changes and reforms we're talking about that we can begin delinking those two things so that we actually get those who serve and protect us to maintain the health and safety of all of us in our communities. But we owe them a debt of gratitude, and we also have to maintain and preserve their health and safety and well-being also. I thank all of our panelists for being here with us this evening. I thank Colorado Humanities for sponsoring this event, and I turn it back over to Adrian Miller.
Well, thank you, Penfield, and also Vanessa, Cusair, Justin, and Nick for sharing your knowledge and insights to help us better understand the legacy of race in America. Thanks also to the audience and audience members who posed questions. Thank you again to our sponsors and community partners. We weren't able to get to everyone's questions tonight, but you can continue the conversation online in our Legacy of Race Facebook group and at future programs. Please sign up for news at the bottom of any page of the Colorado Humanities website, which is coloradohumanities.org. Our next programs in this series will focus on Indigenous peoples' experience and also young community leaders. So please look forward to those programs coming up in the next few months. Have a good evening.